On the eve of the general election, this edition of IIEA Insights looks at what the foreign policy priorities of the next government should be. It's a new rapid-fire format with each of the seven speakers giving their views over a 5-minute period. So we hope that hasn't put too much stress on the speakers. It's often harder to write a short letter than a long letter, as one of the speakers just mentioned beforehand. So without further ado, let me introduce the first speaker. Edward Burke is an assistant professor in the history of war since 1945 at UCD. And from 2010 to 2011, he was seconded by the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs to serve as the deputy head of the International Police Coordination Board in Kabul, Afghanistan, having previously served as an analyst at the EU police mission in that country. He's also worked as a foreign policy fellow in think tanks in Madrid and London. Ed, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dan. So rapid 5 minutes. I have 5.5 points to get through. The first is, of course, transatlantic relations. That I think that this is the elections for every EU member state in Washington were obviously seismic, but Ireland is particularly exposed. We are, of course, the biggest per capita exporter to the US. And therefore, the announcements, yesterday, which may be simply setting out a stall that Trump is going to impose 25% tariffs, etc., is of course hugely alarming for Ireland in terms of our interests. And so we'll have to have a proportionate response in terms of working, as we often do, historically very well, as working Congress. But of course, we are now dealing with a Congress which is less familiar to some extent to Irish diplomats in terms of the type of intake that we've seen to the Republican Party in recent years. So it's going to be a huge task, and we're going to have to leverage, look at our diaspora and make the case with other close partners, not least the EU and the UK, to try and mitigate and try and essentially engage in some. This will be transactional. And so it will be a transaction discussion with the United States. And of course, we are also then looking at the United States talking extremely firmly to Ireland about the threat from China, how exposed we are to China in terms of our investments, in terms of our lack of security capability. And so I've no doubt that when it comes to industrial espionage, the Chinese Ministry for State Security will be mentioned quite frequently in terms of its activities in Europe. And that brings me on to my second point, which is the European defence, which is essentially that Emmanuel Macron has spoken in recent weeks about that there is now a distinction in Europe and indeed in the world between herbivores and carnivores, which was, a particularly blunt Élysée statement where he said, the world is made up of herbivores and carnivores. And if we decide, or some of EU member states decide to remain herbivores, then the carnivores will win and we will be a market firm. So, of course, Ursula von der Leyen yesterday talked about European defence spending being completely unacceptable and that the EU member states all need to take a close look at themselves in terms of what they're spending. And that the current average 1.9% was utterly insufficient to meet the threats to Europe. And so that's clearly Ireland is an absolute outlier there and will come under increased pressure, not only to improve our own capabilities, but also to contribute much more exponentially to EU defence funding, and also to be active in it. So when it comes to the EDF, but also the European Defence Industrial Programme that's now under consultation, there's going to be a lot of pressure on rich EU member states to make contributions there. And of course, Ireland will be expected to be very much a Sweden in terms of Sweden's prior pre-NATO position as a major sort of defence industry in terms of not blocking when it comes to the use of EU, when it comes to the use of weapons in, for example, Ukraine. So that's Switzerland has obviously had some issues around that. Switzerland is still grappling around that. So if Ireland wants to increase its defence industrial base, then it will have to sort of understand that there will be very little tolerance for Ireland to block EU defence spending. And of course, we need to also recognise that the number one European pillar defence priority now is to save NATO. Saving NATO is the absolute priority of defence ministries and indeed many foreign ministries across many EU member states. And that is going to affect CFSP and CSDP. And so we need to also understand that European security is very much bound up with the irreplaceable role that NATO has in terms of European defence. So again, Ireland, we should not delude ourselves about that. And at the same time, EU member states, not least the Commission, will be looking at Ireland to improve our capabilities when it comes to maritime, cyber, data protection, counterintelligence for dual use, pushing back on industrial espionage. And that comes to my third point, which is China. And ultimately, the Taoiseach made a widely criticised speech, it must be said, in terms of at least Chinese state opinion, last year when he talks about how different Ireland's worldview and interest and values were from that of the PRC government. So that's something which he's committed to not yielding on. And it'll be interesting to see what the next government does. But I think that there'll be very little appetite in Washington and Brussels for Ireland ducking the fact that China is involved in systematic major espionage in Europe in terms of trying to seize dual-use technologies. We have to protect the rules-based orders, of course. The UN, the ICC, the ICJ, ECJ, ECHR all come under enormous pressure in the coming years. So we'll need to do something about that. Finally, fifth point, resetting Irish-UK relations. Stormont House 2. What are we going to do about legacy? 121 people lost their lives in the Troubles. The UK is interested in terms of what Ireland has to offer for a new joint approach by both governments. And of course, the UK defence industry is completely intertwined in the European market. So if we're going to spend more in European defence, get things done, the UK needs to be essentially almost like a Norway in terms of its relationship on defence and foreign policy with Europe. So Ireland should be an advocate about that, not a laggard.
Brilliant. 10 seconds over. Perfect. Thank you so much for joining us. Next speaker, Clifford Coonan, a long-time resident of China, whose writings will be familiar to many of you from the Irish Times. He's currently a China analyst, reporter, producer, and editor with Deutsche Welle in Berlin. Clifford, over to you.
Hi there. Well, thanks for having me today. And in some ways, I'm probably going to echo there's going to be some overlap with these points, but I'm looking at things very much through the China prism and more broadly through the Asian prism, given that there are so many changes going on over there. That's a familiar tale at this stage, and I don't need to go into that too much. But Ireland increasingly needs to make a choice on these things. For a long time, it was quite easy to balance Ireland's economic interests with its diplomatic interests. And I think the key challenge facing the incoming foreign minister will be how to frame policy in the second Trump era, particularly when it comes to China. And given that we have such strong trade and diplomatic ties to Beijing, but the days where we can juggle these relationships, I think, are definitely coming to a close. When ministers could arrive in Beijing and say they would beef up they would drum up business and then make some weak comments about human rights, Ireland is going to have to take a side. So if we look at China briefly, just to say it's going through a major transition, which is disruptive, politically problematic from a policy standpoint. Its own narratives are very optimistic and self-serving, but it's also still uniquely positioned to exploit its dominance in global manufacturing. And it's also got a unique role in climate change plans and net zero strategies. So we see a contrast where China has some notable areas of technological and scientific excellence in things like e-vehicles, high-speed rail, biotech innovation, but they're also mired in a morass of macroeconomic troubles, property market collapse, falling investment, a series of politically driven crackdowns on private enterprise, demographics, which see China getting old before getting rich, unlike, say, Japan. And the policy steps that we've seen come from the Communist Party show that the Leninist leadership are not really well equipped to resolve these problems. So you've got a lot of instability in China, and it's not what it was 10 years ago, and the approach to China has to change for that. At the same time, it's emerging as a security threat, and I'd like to say hello to any members of the MSS who are listening in now today. We have TikTok and Shein and Shine having their European HQs in Ireland. It's problematic. It's increasingly problematic. So combine that then with the EU problem, which is a further complication, again, looking at through the China prism. A future foreign minister will have to listen to sort of powerful engagement lobbies in Europe who are speaking for industry, notably Germany, of course, which has taken a baffling approach in many ways to how it deals with China, which seems largely aimed at propping up its ailing car industry. Rather than trying to innovate its way out of trouble, it's trying to just block Chinese cars coming in while boosting its industry there. There's a lesson in this, I think, and then tie that into China's relationship with Russia, which has caused a major problem. The forming of loose alliances among authoritarian states and dictatorships around China and Russia is an increased security threat to the European Union. In recent days, we've seen reports of the Chinese vessel Yipeng 3 cutting cables in the Baltic. We've got Russian ships off the Irish coast. So after the successful accession of Finland and Sweden, presumably the incoming foreign minister is going to have to reopen the debate about Ireland joining NATO. if Ireland has to make a decision about its role with China, it's going to have to start thinking about security issues again. And Ireland does not want to risk being seen as a bad actor by the US, which is, of course, a key, as was mentioned earlier, is a key partner. So again, keeping the focus on Asia Pacific doesn't mean cutting off ties, trade ties. There's a lot of other opportunities. Even Germany is diversifying out of China recently. And we're seeing things that it's looking much more to India, with a huge trade delegation from Germany to India recently. India is equally a problematic democracy, but there are opportunities there. So any incoming foreign minister is going to have to maybe focus less on China and look more to other opportunities in the region.
Right. And that flag, Clifford, was for 4 minutes. So if you have a further point, you got another 30 seconds.
All right. Well, basically, I just think that Ireland needs to there is a possibility that Ireland can leverage this role that it has with China into some kind of brokerage role, perhaps in looking at EU-China relations, US-EU-China relations. It needs to take sides, obviously, but at the same time, it's also in a very good position in that it has these relations. So that could also be another opportunity for Ireland within the next few years.
Excellent. Thanks so much
for
that. Moving on, our next speaker, Bill Emmott, is the author of many books, including his latest, Deterrence, Diplomacy, and the Risk of Conflict over Taiwan. He previously served as editor-in-chief of The Economist for 13 years and has recently become a citizen of Ireland, having been a resident here for some time. Bill, over to you.
Thank you very much, Dan, and it's a delight to be with you. I mean, I start on this interesting challenge by a matter of principle, which is that I think any country with a new government needs to set clear priorities. It cannot do everything. It cannot expect to have influence on everything simultaneously. The priorities, I think, for a small country like Ireland, in this circumstance of huge geopolitical challenges, particularly coming from the new Trump administration, as Edward said, but also from the challenge from China and Russia, should be, first of all, number one priority has to be European Union and supporting, but also helping to recreate European solidarity with regard to the threats that are being posed, especially by both Russia and by Trump's trade policy. I think that the key issue for the new government will be, of course, seeking to be flattering to the new Trump administration, including on the traditional St. Patrick's Day visit to Washington by the Taoiseach. But when it flatters, it should absolutely be clear that it is not looking to divide itself from any other European country. Ireland, to satisfy its needs, to satisfy its priorities, desperately needs European solidarity over trade and, above all, over security. Ireland is militarily neutral, but politically not neutral, and emphasizing through that European solidarity Ireland's support for the future sovereignty of Ukraine, the future security guarantees of Ukraine, the future freedoms of Ukraine will be absolutely vital as a priority for the new government. I think the second priority should be one that was also been already said, but I'll emphasize it even more, given that I'm a dual UK and Irish citizen, and that is, I think that Ireland can play an extra role in persuading the UK to get back closer to the European Union. That's a European Union policy in negotiating with the UK, but Ireland can act as, if you like, a horse whisperer, helping to seduce Britain to make it more comfortable with making some of the changes and concessions it needs to. I think that the UK government, the Labour government, knows it should be doing that, but is politically scared of doing it too aggressively. I think Ireland can help with that. And then a third priority, which perhaps is a more accidental priority to do with the year rather than major foreign policy challenges, which is that as somebody who follows Japan very closely, I'm conscious that in 2025, the biggest ever capital investment outside the state by the state of Ireland is coming to fruition, namely Ireland House, the new combined embassy and headquarters for all the Irish agencies in Japan. This is a big investment. It is actually a major opportunity as well in the specific case of Ireland's relations with Japan, trade relations, business relations, tourism relations. And I think in this year, which also has the Expo in Osaka, a very important task for Irish ministers will be to support this investment by getting on planes and going out there and appearing and supporting events. So I think that while Irish-Japanese relations are not going to be number one in the list, nonetheless, there's a special Irish opportunity in the opening of Ireland House. And if I can be there at the same time, I will proudly boast my Irish citizenship in offering my support too.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Bill. Let me just say to the other speakers who are coming later, don't worry about overlap. We're saying the same thing. That's instructive and interesting in and of itself. So, frame the same points as you wish. Don't sort of censor yourself or edit it out because somebody else has said it. Good. So our next speaker is Mary Fitzgerald, non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. Mary Fitzgerald is a writer, researcher, and consultant specializing in the Mediterranean region with a focus on Libya, and she joins us today from sunny Marseille. Mary.
Thank you very much, Dan. So I would start off by making the point that, as we all know, a world that is increasingly multipolar and less multilateral is a world that is much more challenging for Ireland in terms of how it engages with that world and how it projects itself. I'm going to focus on Ireland's engagement with the Middle East, North Africa, but also Africa, the continent as a whole. As we know, ODA, Overseas Development Assistance, through Irish Aid, the Department of Foreign Affairs Development Arm, has been a key pillar of Irish foreign policy for many years. I think the world we're living in right now, the fact that the Middle East and Africa have become much more geopolitical spaces presents all kinds of challenges for a country like Ireland. But let's start with what remains a key priority for the government, and that's not going to change anytime soon, and that is the Middle East peace process. We know that Ireland's position for many years has been one of supporting the idea of getting back to credible negotiations towards a two-state solution. Over the past year, since the attack of October 7th and the ongoing war in Gaza, Ireland has carved out an interesting kind of a bigger space in the European conversation that I think is not only interesting, but also an important space, along with, of course, Spain and Belgium. So over the last year, we saw Ireland say that it would recognize the state of Palestine, also along with Spain, calling for a review of the EU's trade agreement with Israel. Now, some skeptics might say, well, why is Ireland so invested in this conflict far away? What I would say that in Brussels, I'm struck by conversations I've had with officials from other countries where they make the point that what Ireland and Spain are doing in terms of ensuring that a space remains in the European conversation on the conflict, that is really, really important right now, and really important for the day when the conflict in Gaza is over and we're back to some effort to return to negotiations. Ireland, of course, has been supportive of the Arab Peace Initiative, which is quite old at this point. There are calls right now to resurrect that once a ceasefire is in place and we're back to the prospect of negotiations. It's also really important, I think, to note here that despite the events of the past year, no Arab country that signed up to the Abraham Accords has cancelled that decision, essentially, or withdrawn from the Accords. That's really, really important. It shows that the key Arab states here still have in mind this idea of a peace process in the future leading to a two-state framework. And that's something, I think, that's a process when it happens that Ireland can engage with it as in a credible way, given the perceptions of Ireland over the last year in terms of the positions it has taken, the perceptions in the Middle East and North Africa. There's a role, I think, for Ireland to play there. And related to that, I mean, we've seen the UN Secretary General note several times over the last year that there are more armed conflicts ongoing in the world today than at any point since World War II, more than 120 armed conflicts across the world at this point. We know that the Department of Foreign Affairs has had a conflict resolution unit for some years. It's now part of the Peace and Stability Unit within the department. And I think there's a real opportunity here to build on the work that that unit has already done. We know it's done work in East Timor and Colombia, et cetera, but to really kind of focus efforts on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict within the unit. I think this is something, the lessons of the Northern Ireland peace process are a value added in terms of perceptions of Ireland in different parts of the world. Related to that, also the fact that the government has embraced the women, peace and security agenda in recent years. It was a top priority when Ireland was recently on the UN Security Council. I think there's a lot of potential there to build on that further. I mean, we've seen across the world, the women, peace and security agenda is being embraced by so many. I think there's an opportunity here for Ireland to distinguish itself further in that. And then finally, on Irish aid and the Overseas Development Assistance Programme more generally, the government remains committed to allocating 0.7% of GNI to overseas development assistance by 2030. That commitment is pretty much set in stone. It's a matter of getting there. There are different recommendations in terms of how the focus of Ireland's aid programme should perhaps change or adapt to new realities. Going back again to the point I made earlier about Africa being an intensely geopolitical space right now, with not only China, but also Russia, very much active on the ground, very much feeding anti-Western sentiments and European sentiments on the ground. That's something that I think Ireland will have to bear in mind in terms of how it can kind of navigate those new realities on the continent of Africa, where so much of the Irish aid programme is focused, and being alive to those challenges. And then just finally, because it's part of a conversation in Brussels and several other EU member states, particularly in relation to the Middle East and North Africa, how you bring about what people are calling green diplomacy or energy diplomacy into the conversations. Given the conversation in Europe about the climate emergency, the extent to which you can bring the question of green transitions and energy diplomacy into conversations you have with your interlocutors, Middle East, North Africa, Africa more generally, I think that's something that Ireland should also consider.
Thanks, Mary. Appreciate that. Next up is Declan Kelleher, former member of the Department of Foreign Affairs. His last posting was as Perm Rep to Brussels during the tumultuous period of Brexit negotiations. And prior to that, he was Irish ambassador to China, where by the time he left, I think he was one of the longest serving diplomats in Beijing from any other country. Declan, over to you.
Thanks, Dan. I'm conscious of the 5-minute rule. So let me say, first of all, I think it's important to emphasize that this is a fundamental watershed moment facing Ireland. There are severe geopolitical headwinds, in fact, a perma-crisis that's there. I think it's worth recalling that the last of the classically transatlantic US presidents will leave the scene. Internationalist. President Trump is confrontationalist by tactic as well as conviction, and has a transactional approach to geopolitics. That's the American side. On the European Union side, we have a new commission. It will be more centralized than the previous commission, which at one level should lead to more coherence, at another level poses the risk of policy bottlenecks, which is a challenge at a particularly important time. We have a drift to the right in the European Union. We have challenges now to what had been post-Brexit, a very strong impulse to EU unity. And we have structural challenges, which have been taken up by former head of the European Central Bank, Draghi, in his report. So my basic point is this is a very different situation facing Ireland and the EU from Trump's first ascension to power in 2017. And on China, I mean, the US clearly wants to stymie the rise of China. And China, as Clifford says, has economic problems essentially self-inflicted for doctrinal reasons to a large extent. But it has streaked ahead on high tech, even in the last year, partly because of the constraints imposed by the US, and is a leading trading partner of 128 countries. It's also retooling its approach to the international order, revamping the Belt and Road Initiative. So any way you put it, it's a major player and a major challenge. In terms of the specific challenges for Ireland on Trump, you have known unknowns and known knowns. One of the known unknowns is that he is essentially transactional. That's the wild card. But the knowns all pose particular challenges for Ireland as well as opportunities. First of all, he will expect the EU, including Ireland, to do more on defence. And it's worthwhile recalling that Bob Lighthizer, his former trade representative, in his book, which was published 18 months ago, this has been in plain sight, singled out two EU countries for particular criticism, Germany and Ireland, for A, running trade surpluses with the US, and B, for not doing enough on defense. Secondly, we have a shifting conception of trade in the US. It's no longer free trade. It's no longer a Ricardoite comparative advantage. It's a move to a jobs-based approach, but this is not specifically Trumpite. This was also a defining characteristic of the Biden administration. And if you remember the Inflation Reduction Act and his approach to trade generally, it's fundamentally industrial policy and protectionist. Third, the EU will be expected to do more geoeconomically on China, but there are limits to this. The EU takes a de-risking approach. The US takes a decoupling approach. There are legal constraints on what the EU can do and how far it can go. Let me give a very practical example. For the US, the presence of any Chinese electric vehicle on an American road is unacceptable because of its connectivity, its software. It's not the case in the EU, which actually needs cheap electrical vehicles to help it on the green transition. So there will be some kind of sparring on this as this goes forward in terms of Trump 2's expectations and what the EU can deliver. Also, we know that the approach of the Trump team to high US tech is kind of conflicted. Musk good, Google bad. So we have to see where things fall on that in terms of regulation and in terms of how the US will respond to the EU regulatory impulse. One other point, and it tends to be forgotten, I think, is that Trump will be influenced by the markets in his approach to tariffs and other things. Inflation will be a bad thing. He's talked about using currency variations as a kind of counter. That, as you know, Dan, there are limits on how far you can do that if you want to stay as a reserve currency. So there are going to be constraints there. The other point about Trump, I think, worth bearing is that he clearly sees tariffs as an instrument, escalate to de-escalate. One very good example is the conversation he had yesterday with a Mexican leader, which was essentially about migration and drugs. So clearly Trump was gushing after the discussion. So tariffs are going to be a kind of stick in the bag rather than kind of imposed willy-nilly. From the EU perspective, I think the Draghi approach based on, first of all, new approach to innovation, competition, and enabling the EU to compete with US and China. Secondly, decarbonization. And third, economic security are going to pose challenges for Ireland. What should Ireland do? I'm sure this is already being considered, is to engage upstream within the European Union, seek appropriate allies, look at proposals on state aids, look at proposals on capital markets union, which in some member states, including Ireland, have had some hesitations on. Essentially, also take advantage of the proposed Commission pullback on regulation for business, which von der Leyen emphasized yesterday. That's a positive thing, and that may be an area for, if you like, if not convergence, then looking at possibilities in terms of dealing with the Trump administration. And again, developing that point to look for friendly solutions with the US. This has been done before by the EU. In 2018, Juncker did a deal with Trump where he'd agreed to buy LNG and soybeans. China did it in 2020 in the phase one agreement to agree to buy lots of American stuff. Christine Lagarde said it yesterday that, look, let's not get up in our tariffs, let's buy American goods. So, and that, given Trump's transactional approach, that could be something certainly worth looking at. Very, very quickly and finally on defence. And here I speak as an Irish, indeed the only Irish co-chair of the EU-NATO ambassadorial meetings, which used to take place. I hear what Edward said. I think we should be constructive. There are clearly limits politically, domestically, in how far things can go. But it's important we be constructive and not be an obstacle. And that I've heard at a very senior level from the Council in the Union in Brussels quite recently. It's a minimalist approach, but I think we need to take steps on this one, and the steps cannot obviously be too long. So not block decisions, essentially. I think that's very important. And remember too, on defense, that even if Trump gets a deal on Ukraine with Putin, and let's hope he brings the EU into it, and of course, Zelensky, that is not going to remove the perceptions of existential threat felt by a number of our EU member state colleagues. So defense is here to stay, and defense expenditure and the development of the defense industrial base is going to be a central theme as we move forward. And finally, and I plead for a couple of seconds, words matter. And I want to mention the following points. First of all, I hear the references to Ireland should not get caught between the US and the EU on tariffs and Trump. I think we need to be careful to avoid that language. First of all, remember the UK sought to divide the EU on Brexit, and we resisted that successfully to very good effect. China obviously seeks to serenade various EU member states, and Trump dislikes the EU in principle, prefers that it wouldn't exist, and has clearly said that he's going to work through people like Orban to try and, if you like, divide the EU. I think we as Ireland need to be very careful that what we do and say is entirely conducing to coherence within the EU. So I think it's important on that point. Secondly, Bill Emmott referred to the possibility of Ireland being a kind of whisperer to the UK. Yes, it's in Ireland's interests and the interests of other member states for the UK to have a close relationship with the EU, but at all costs should avoid being perceived as an agent of the UK. This should be a prosecution of Irish interests. So again, I think words matter and the framing of the narrative matters. And the final point, if I may, to Mary, I think when we talk about multipolarity and multilateralism, I think we should bear in mind that multipolarity is a definition of a situation. Multilateralism is an organizing principle. And I think it's important just to keep those distinctions in mind, because I see in certain parts of the world, the two concepts are being used almost interchangeably. Thanks, and I apologize if I've gone over time.
Okay, thank you, Declan. I think we might have some people back to have a more traditional debate in this format again at some time in the future, but thanks for those. Next, Michael Sullivan is an advisor on the intersection of investment and geopolitics and an author. His most recent book, The Leveling, makes the case that globalization, as it has been known for the past 30 years, is over. He's a PhD in economics and more than 25 years experience in the international financial services industry. Mike, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Dan. Just for context, I mean, to start off with, I'm based in Paris, and from there, I think Ireland is increasingly an outlier in foreign policy terms in a couple of respects. And worryingly, from that view, our sort of soft power may well have peaked. In terms of being an outlier, the debate that takes place in, say, France or the European countries is very different to that in Ireland, or at least it's absent in Ireland. The election campaign was instructive in that there was very, very little focus on security and defence. And then I think in hard terms, if I compare Ireland to other small open economies or countries or even formerly neutral countries, we just don't have a defense and security infrastructure. And I think that will increasingly be called out by international events. So I think many countries regard us as being eccentric and quirky in terms of the way we treat foreign policy and defense. From a purely hard economics point of view, to catch up on Sweden, Norway, etc., we would probably have to spend between 15 to 20 billion euros a year for the next 6 or 7 years to build hard infrastructure. I think the good news is that military technology and techniques are changing so quickly that we don't have a legacy to deal with. If you look at what's happening in unmanned drones, unmanned fighters, underwater vehicles, etc. So the ability to catch up is probably quicker than maybe it might have been 10 or 15 years ago. I think one of the issues we have in Ireland compared to, let's say, Sweden or even the Netherlands is that the issues of defense and security are just not in our DNA. They're not in the DNA of our elected representatives. And I think that's something that somehow needs to be remedied because I think our elected representatives and the next government will increasingly have to talk about defense and security to the Irish people. My personal view is it's much less a question of being coerced down this avenue by NATO or the EU, but simply the need for us as a sort of sovereign nation to be able to defend ourselves. So I think trying to build up a DNA in this segment is something that's going to be very, very important and could take 5, 10, 15 years or so. The second point to make is the idea to introduce the idea of a diplomatic crash. And I'll try and explain what I mean by that. A bit like a stock market crash, a diplomatic crash happens when you invest a lot of resource, a lot of soft power, a lot of diplomatic time and relationships in a cause or in institutions, and they suddenly become devalued over time. So an example might be the UK special relationship with America, which could well be devalued. Ireland, like many other countries, has rightly invested a lot in world institutions, the UN, the World Trade Organization. And in this context of great power rivalry and of a very nakedly transactional Trump government, I fear these institutions will be devalued, and we have to look to other avenues for power. Another example is the Middle East, where I'm unfortunately not as optimistic or sanguine as Mary. The risk, and I think it's a very live risk, is that there could be a peace deal in the Middle East, but that it almost ignores the Palestine as an entity or as a state, and you get a deal that's done between Israel, Egypt, Saudi, the Emirates, that's really more focused on investment, on disabling Iran than it is on Palestine. And again, we've invested so much in that cause that there will be a feeling of powerlessness. So I think that's it's a clear risk ahead for Ireland. The other, I think, shifting sands that are worth paying attention to is the diminished relative power of France and at the moment Germany until the next election on the European stage, and the rise in power of countries like Poland and the Baltic states. And Poland is a country I believe is one of the future powers of Europe, and as a country I think we should invest much more time in diplomatically. And then I think someone referenced this, the new government at the EU level is much more focused now on this idea of strategic autonomy, which is a phrase we never hear about in Ireland, and is certainly rarely operationalized in Ireland. And I think part of our foreign policy and our investment policy and economic policy needs to be to pinpoint elements of this strategic autonomy umbrella. It can be really pushing capital markets union. It can be technologies like quantum, where we're not really a player, and really focusing on those. And that has got big implications for our universities, and trying to better fund our universities and turn individual departments into more elite research centers in areas like engineering and physics. And then just a final point on Asia. was in Asia last week. If I take Singapore as a comparator to Ireland, a country that 60 years ago was nothing, and is now one of the wealthiest countries in the world. It's a tenth the size of County Cork, but they have an active army 10 times the size of the Irish Army. So that's a benchmark that should really make us think. Two different investors in Singapore asked me if I thought the euro was going to survive, which shocked me because I haven't had that question in Europe in a long time. And it suggested to me that people far afield have an existential fear about Europe, and that we as Europeans, and Ireland as a country that's at the center of financial diplomacy, we need to tell our story, our financial story, much better. And I think we need to connect better and have a better dialogue with countries like Vietnam and Singapore, and maybe be slightly less obsessed with China.
Thanks, Mike. Last but certainly not least, Mary Whelen held a wide range of roles during her career at the Department of Foreign Affairs, including as permanent representative to the UN and the WHO. She also led, on the soft power side, Ireland's successful campaign for a seat on the UN Security Council at the turn of the century. Mary.
So I'm going to discuss about Irish foreign policy in the context of the Irish electorate. And that actually is very strange because I don't think other speakers have really addressed that particular issue. Now, the focus on the reason we'll have a new foreign minister probably is because we will have an election, and the election is focused on domestic economic issues. And Irish people understand that to have the type of economy that we have and to have the resources in order to deliver on domestic issues, whether they be better services, whether it be more employment, we need to have an open trading system, free flow of capital, and international stability. And so we need to have a foreign policy based around securing and promoting these concepts, and we need respect for the rule of law. And as others have said, the geopolitical tectonic plates are shifting, and rampant aggressive nationalism is a characteristic now of many large states and of some medium-sized states. This can be seen in the United States. Will they, won't they introduce tariffs? We don't know. It's a negotiating tactic, but we can't ignore it. We can see it in the Russian invasion of Ukraine, rampant nationalism. We can see it in the Chinese support for Russia, not because they necessarily support international instability, but because it suits them to oppose the US through assisting Russia at the moment. We see it in the Koreans fighting in Ukraine, and we see it in the Iranians also supporting Russia. We know hybrid threats have increased. Irish people are very aware of what happened during COVID with the attack on the HSE system. We're very well aware of the fact that the subsea cables are being threatened by Russian presence around our coast. And coming back to the concept that foreign policy is the expression of a state's domestic policies as they impact on and are impacted by the external environment, then I think that we need to look at how we might need to change our foreign policy to take account of that. And again, basing myself on the election, I have looked at the election manifestos and see what they've said, and I wouldn't recommend it. They're not particularly enlightening. But I'm going to take two sides of a very narrow spectrum. One is the Fine Gael manifesto, and it says that Ireland must be able to defend itself. Well, that's sort of what states do. And unlike other political parties, it says we will not shirk our responsibility and leave it to others to defend our citizens. So Fine Gael undertakes to adopt a more assertive defence and security policy, and at the same time it commits to doing this in a way that protects our policy of military neutrality. The manifesto also speaks very strongly of a stronger EU and support for a same, and Fianna Fáil is somewhat on the same lines, perhaps in a less aggressive way, let us say. Sinn Féin, which represents a sizable percentage of the Irish population, how sizable we'll find out tomorrow, proposes a referendum to enshrine neutrality in the Constitution. And we cannot get too far away from these political domestic issues. Other priorities for Sinn Féin is working to achieve an end to the conflict in Ukraine using our neutral position to aid these efforts, developing closer diplomatic ties with Palestine, enacting the illegal Israeli settlements divestment bill and the occupied territories bill, and they're also going to work with others to strengthen the international system. Now, we all know that statements on Irish foreign policy tend to be aspirational, and even with a nod to being inspirational. And our public discourse tends to be moralistic rather than realistic. However, when you look at the implementation of policy, I think that Ireland has always had quite a pragmatic approach to issues, and that is what I expect will continue. But pragmatic, not too obvious, but gradual realignment on certain matters. With the threats to an open global economy growing, a strong and prosperous EU is at the core of our concerns, domestic and international. And that is where we will be found. We will be found, whoever is in power, trying to stay at the centre of the EU, trying to promote EU competitiveness, single market unions, complete the single market, and whatever else you're having, except for the one big issue, and that issue is defence. At the same time, I think there is a growing recognition that our policy needs to be more clearly elucidated. I do not see the possibility of our Irish neutrality disappearing as a central core of the policies of the next government. I just don't think that will happen. But what I can see is, and what is happening already, and what started really with Micheál Martin and the consultative forum we had last year, is a greater definition of what that means and a clearer understanding of what the solidarity aspects of the European Union mean also. And I think that debate is happening, and it will change not because the French think badly of us or somebody else think we're quirky. It'll change because the Irish public begin to see this is affecting them. This is affecting our, not them, I should say our security and our prosperity. And I want to come back to another aspect of our neutrality. It has always been balanced by commitment to the multilateral system. So, you know, when we say we're neutral, you will find that politicians will always say, or Irish people will always say, but we are very happy to commit to the UN and peacekeeping. But the UN is no longer what it was, if it ever was. It's a parody of really what it was intended to be. Because multilateralism has always been a system whereby the powerful agree to be constrained by rules. And that is no longer the case. America, Russia, China, India, Iran, even smaller states like Israel, they are not constrained by rules. And that is the reality. That is the reality facing the world today. So before summing up, I'm going to say, in addition to our engagement with the EU, which will be at the heart of our foreign policy, we need to have very strong economic and political ties with our nearest neighbour, Britain, not only because that makes sense in bilateral sense, but also because of the importance of Northern Ireland. So that shared Ireland issue must also be at the core of our policy. Beyond Europe, and I think this is very much a third wheel, beyond Europe, the new government should foster closer relationships with governments important to our economic prosperity, which are frequently, but not always, countries with which we share values or long relationships or whatever. Coming again and ending with the international system, we need to cooperate with other countries to salvage and make good what can still be got to work, especially in the humanitarian area, in the health area, and economic cooperation where that is feasible, but we should not be unrealistic about that. And one final word, I think that the rule of law underpins everything. It underpins our economy, it underpins peace, it underpins prosperity. And I think the more we can put that and think creatively on the area of the rule of law at the international level, the better and the safer we will be.
Many thanks, Mary, and many thanks to the 6 other speakers. I hope people found this format useful, interesting. We're very happy to have feedback from members and people who attended or people who listened to the podcast on the format and whether we might try it again in the future. But in the meantime, again, thanks to our 7 speakers. Thanks to everyone who tuned in. And we all look forward to the exit poll tomorrow night at 10 o'clock to see who might be the next foreign minister. Thank you all. Have a good afternoon.